been involved in science communication for about 7 years now. And I started out as an independent blogger. I was just on, a Blogspot blog. And, a few years in, I got invited to be in the Scientific American blog network. This is a really big deal. I was so excited. This was the heyday of science blogging in a lot of ways. There was an archipelago of blog networks that were all starting at this time. There was a conference called Science Online that had been running for a few years at this point. And you had to be kind of in the in crowd in order to get lotteried to get in. And you felt really cool to be part of the in jokes, to be part of this really fun crowd of people who really cared about science. Unfortunately, not too long into my time at Scientific American, my boss, who was also called the blog father, was sort of the person who was looked at with a ton of admiration in our community, turned out to be a serial sexual harasser. And I had never experienced any of this myself. I had been affirmed and supported and lifted up by this person. And so what was really hard about it is that, on the one hand, it was devastating to learn about all of these victims who had been deeply hurt and who, for a long time, had felt like they couldn't share their stories. And then what was worst was that moment inside of me at first, when I was like, well, this hasn't happened to me, and this is a person I really care about. And I had to learn. This was a really major tough love moment for me, where I had to learn what it looks like to support victims, whether or not the perpetrator is your friend. And it led to a lot of sort of soul searching, and I began to really doubt whether or not I belonged as a science blogger, because I and several other female science bloggers who had never been harassed at all by this guy came to realize that we were his feminist front in a lot of ways. We were the folks that made him look good and made him look like he wasn't doing anything wrong. And that really took the love of science blogging out of me, to be totally honest. I managed to be at SciAm for a little bit longer, but at a certain point, I just had to stop. It just wasn't the right place for me. At the same time that this was happening, it led to me thinking a lot about our climate and our community. And this in crowd that at first I thought I so desperately wanted to be a part of, and I so desperately wanted to be in and cool and in this clique, I began to realize maybe the way we were organized, which was, are you cool? Does the blog father like you? Is maybe not the healthiest way to have any kind of community. And, are we even reaching the people that we want to reach? Are we stepping outside the ivory tower, or are we just writing posts that that our friends really like? And that's what really changed things for me and made me decide I didn't really want to do it anymore. So to my mind, some of the big problems that I faced with science blogging, and I don't think this is true for everybody, but for me, the big problems were a narrow audience. I surveyed my readers fairly early on to find out just who tends to read my blog, and the majority of my readers were white female anthropologists. So, like me. And while it's really important for blogs to produce scholarship, and there are scholarly blog posts and whole communities of scholars who engage on blogs, my goal was not just to talk to my people. My goal was to talk to lots of people, and I clearly was not achieving that goal. And so I began to think more about the medium and more about one of the main problems, for me at least, for science blogging, which was that it's really easy to adopt the deficit model when your whole job is just talking at people and giving them your hot take on something. And I wanted to move away from a model that said, I'm the expert and I'm going to just in a top-down way pass on information to other people, and try to do what's called the dialogue model. So one that understands that people are, anybody in the public can contribute to the scientific conversation, can aid in scientific advances and discovery, and not that there's just a certain ivory tower full of scientists that are the keepers of all the knowledge, that instead this knowledge can be gained in many ways. There's also science communication literature out there that says there's a few other key components to really get your message across. And that's emotion, narrative, and perspective taking. So, I think that this past election taught us a lot about the fact that facts don't actually matter when it comes to passing on information and changing people's minds. The appeal to emotion and understanding people's lived experiences and where they are coming from is how you'll actually reach them. So, the deficit model is never going to get us to a day where climate change is real is like somehow part of our Pledge of Allegiance, or the NIH or NSF suddenly have unlimited funding and we all are doing all the science of our dreams. If we want to get to a more scientifically literate public, we have to be engaging in dialogue. For me, podcasting was how I could make that happen. Podcasting is a space where, because you're using audio, and because many of the models of podcasting is bringing other people into your space, you get to have conversations. So you're having dialogue, right? But the other thing that's really great about podcasting is that I'm no longer the expert with all the knowledge. Instead, yes, I have some expertise, right? There's some thought that goes into it. My voice is a major part of what makes Period Podcast work. But at the same time, what I'm getting to do is, instead of blogging, where it was people on Twitter were constantly asking me, I want the Kate Clancy take on this event or this paper, which got really tiring. Instead, what happened was I got to say, well, who are the takes that I want to hear? Who are the people whose voices I want to promote? And can I be really thoughtful and intentional about that? So that's how it went from, this being a podcast that's just interviewing, say, scientific experts, to certainly interviewing scientific experts, but also interviewing educators, kids, entrepreneurs, activists, a whole range of people for whom there was a connection between the topic of my podcast, Periods, and women and femme reproductive physiology, or really any menstruating physiology, to other issues in the wide world, so politics, education, hygiene, health, things like that. So one of the great benefits of podcasting is that, unlike science blogging, which has been shown to be a bit narrow in its focus, where people who already like science read science blogs, and people who are scientists themselves read science blogs, podcasts are listened to by everybody. There's a podcast for everything you can possibly dream of. But what's more, once you kind of get into listening to podcasts, you kind of get addicted, and you listen to more and more and more. And so people find themselves following lots of different types of podcasts that they might not have before. And then suddenly they find themselves, hearing from scientists. So one of the first things that I did was try to work with and reach out to some other podcasts that aren't just science audiences. So, a feminist podcast, a general health podcast, and actually another period podcast were some of the places where I was a guest. And it was a really wonderful experience to share my perspective, but then also to learn from them, to learn from their audience, and, to gain some of their audience by moving into these other spaces. One of the other great benefits for me for podcasting is that it's seasonal rather than sort of weekly content. Blogging can get really tiring. And if you already have a full-time job, like I do, it's really hard to come up with new content every week without going crazy, or without it, frankly, being to the detriment of your other job. So I enjoyed that I have one season already done, and I'm partway through season 2 right now. And that has really made it much more manageable for me to find guests, record them, and then with my sister do the editing later. One of the things I really like about my podcast is, like I said, I'm not just interviewing experts. I'm interviewing lots of different types of people who might have a vested interest in periods in some way, or sometimes have no interest at all. And so I'm going to share with you 3 clips that illustrate some of the important elements of science communication to me around emotion and narrative and perspective taking. So the first episode clip is from episode 4 in season 1. And this is one where I interviewed a whole bunch of kids. I actually talked to my daughter and a whole bunch of her friends, and then all of their moms, and asked them about periods, if they knew what they were made of, what they were like, and then asked the moms, who were then listening to the kids and reacting to the kids, and half the time horrified at what their kids were saying because they thought they had done a good job educating their children, and their children knew nothing about periods. So it was just a really fun experience. So I'm going to share with you a brief clip of my daughter.
Do I get my period?
Yeah.
Yeah? Have you ever seen it?
Mm-hmm.
What's it look like?
It's red.
Do you remember anything else about period besides its color?
I know the other things I just told you.
Mm-hmm.
And comes out of your body.
Where? What part of my body?
What is this called again?
What do you remember? That's okay.
Please tell me, please.
So So do you remember there's urethra and vulva and anus down there in that area?
Yeah, but this.
Yeah, so that one's the vulva.
Vulva.
The next clip I want to share is one that's actually me. And so for the first episode of season 2, so episode 13, my sister, who's my editor, said, why don't we interview you so that your narrative can actually be shared? You've asked the narratives of a lot of other people and heard why they got into what they did, but nobody knows why you have this podcast and why you study periods to begin with. So we decided to kind of turn the tables. She got out from behind the mic and interviewed me. And one of her questions was, when I first learned about periods and where babies came from. And so this is a clip from that. I was at my friend's house, my best friend when I was little, and we were playing. And then this must have been by mutual agreement between the two moms, but my best friend's mom walked in and said, I got a video for you kids to watch on where do babies come from. And then she just popped it in the VCR and walked out. And then we sat there and we watched a video that included graphic cartoon sex. And we're like 7 years old. And it was super weird. The third episode I want to share is episode 6 in season 1. And this is with Laura Shanley, also known as Sue Magina. Sue Magina is an activist, and she started the group Periods for Pence, which you might remember from a little over a year ago when then Governor Pence had created this omnibus abortion bill that had a pretty obvious misunderstanding of just how reproductive biology worked, because part of it included anytime a woman has a miscarriage or an abortion, she must inter the remains, basically have like a funeral, except that lots of miscarriages are just menstruation. So she started calling Pence's office every time she had her period and encouraged other women to do the same, to say, oh, I just got my period and I may or may not have been pregnant, so I may or may not have miscarried. I guess I'd better inter my menstrual blood. Where would you like me to send the pads? And this sparked a giant movement. Thousands of women were calling his office until it got shut down. So this is just a brief clip of her talking about sort of that moment that she got angry and was spurred to action.
One night, I just remember looking over at my husband and I said, this is ridiculous. If he wants to know this much about my body and why I'm making choices for it, he might as well know every little detail of my period. Maybe I should just call him and tell him. My husband looked at me and was like, you might be onto something.
The last point that I want to make is that I think a lot of different media in science communication can be enjoyed differently and can be enjoyed alone or in a group. And what's great about the written word is that you can share it online really easily. So people can share things on Facebook or Twitter, and there can be huge common streams of people reacting and engaging with the material in that way. One of the things that I love about podcasting is that I don't always get to see that engagement, but I hear afterwards about it happening face to face. So some of the more typical engagements that I've heard from a lot of my listeners are moms listening with their daughters. And so they listen to the episodes and then they have a conversation afterwards, like, what did you have questions about? What did you think about this? Did you know that this is something periods did? And they've had a lot of fun using this as a starting point for talking about just female reproductive biology with their daughters. Another fairly obvious one is, I've heard that college professors are sometimes using my podcast in their syllabi or are playing clips of it in their classes. But some of the other really fun ones I've heard is one listener is a prison guard. And she actually plays it in the prison where she works for the people who work there as well as for the prisoners. And she doesn't necessarily report that they always love it, but it's kind of fun to imagine that that's another place that Period Podcast is making its mark. I also heard from a garbage truck driver that he often blares it when he's working so that he and his coworkers can be listening to it together. So we don't always know how these things are getting enjoyed and listened to together, but what's great about audio is it's so portable that sometimes it can be shared among people in a way that we don't always see, but maybe has an even greater impact. At the end of the day, there are a number of ways to break down the ivory tower, and a number of ways for science communication to make its mark and engage differently with the public. As long as your goal is to make science bigger, to make more room, to make it just and more equitable, and a place where different types of questions can be asked, data can be collected differently and interpreted differently, then you're doing it right.